Hello everyone, my name's Ed Armston-Sheret. I work at the Royal Geographical Society and I'm a postdoctoral fellow at the Institute of Historical Research. I feel like I've got a difficult gig after such a great paper and also before canapés and drinks. But I'll try and keep it interesting. Fantastic. So, if I ask you to imagine a Victorian explorer of East Africa, this is probably the sort of image that would come to mind. This is John Hanning Speke, who claimed to have discovered the source of the River Nile in the early 1860s. As you can see, he's sort of posing here with scientific equipment. There's a hunting rifle on his right, and he's standing before Lake Victoria, which was the place he claimed was the source of the River Nile. And my research was about challenging this image of exploration. How can we surface different contributions to 19th century geography? And I did this through focusing on the embodied labour of exploration. So if we look at Speke's journey through East Africa, you can see it here on the map. It goes up here past Lake Victoria and then he went all the way to Cairo. This was a journey that travelled across pre-established trade routes and depended on the labour of literally hundreds of people. And I wanted to find out in my PhD research, how can we recover the day-to-day work that went into these sorts of journeys, the work of carrying, cooking, translating, of caring for explorers when they were sick. And so primary sources, which I guess is what we're here to talk about today, were really important in doing that. And obviously when you come to explorers, there's all sorts of different kinds of primary sources. You've got their published narratives and their private letters. And so a big part of my work was comparing the different ways they wrote about things in public and private. And so in their published narratives, they often portray themselves in heroic terms, and we might sometimes get a slightly different picture from their private narratives. But the big challenge, as we've been discussing today, is that when it comes to these sorts of expeditions, all the sources, almost all the sources in colonial archives are written by expedition leaders who are generally white men and come full and laced with their prejudices and assessments about whose work mattered and what kind of experiences they thought were valuable. But one of the things I did find is that it is still possible to draw out nuances comparing between explorers' public and private writings. And I think this image here shows a slightly different side of travel in East Africa. You can see the explorer lying on a stretcher being physically carried across the country by a group of African men. And this was how explorers travelled on large parts of their journeys. And often in their private diaries, they sort of quite freely acknowledged their dependence on others, but they write quite differently about it in their published narratives. So James Augustus Grant, who travels with Speke and gets very ill, he writes very differently in public about this incident. He sort of complains about the uncomfortable way he was carried and doesn't even draw attention to the fact that people are lifting him for literally hundreds of miles. So I started off, and the other big challenge of looking at the day-to-day work of exploration in this context is when you go into a physical archive and you say to the archivist, "Oh, I'm interested in this sort of question, looking at the work of exploration." They'll say, "Oh, that's very interesting, but that's not really how a lot of our archival records are catalogued." So you go into the archives and it's catalogued according to the name of the expedition leader. And you might find sort of passing references to some of this work, often by chance, and that it's not catalogued. It'd be a throwaway comment at the end of a letter. So I started off doing this project in physical archives, but obviously, as all of you know, the pandemic struck part of the way through my PhD. And so I started using digitized archives much more. And I found that this allowed me to interrogate archives in a slightly different way, using some of the techniques we heard about in the last session, using things like handwriting recognition. And you can suddenly sort of start to put in terms like cooking or certain terms for fever. So if you put in the term fever, you can suddenly find all the times in explorers' accounts where they're ill. And then that often goes hand in hand with caring labour that kept them alive at these critical moments. So I was fortunate to be able to use the Adam Matthew digital archives, and particularly the 19th century literary society collections, which got some really interesting stuff in there because it's the main, it includes the archives of several publishers of travel narratives, and you can see the process by which some of these accounts are worked up for publication and the very different way that explorers wrote about them in public and private. Okay, and yes, and then this is one of the things that I was most excited about finding was the contributions of women, African women, to these expeditions, which is often something that explorers were quite cagey about writing about in their published accounts, but we do find occasional references to. And as a quote here, it says, a few of their women accompanied us, generally carrying a child each on their backs, a small stool on their heads, and inveterably smoking during the march. They would prepare some savoury dish of herbs for their men on getting into camp, where they lived in bell-shaped erections made with boughs of trees. And then there's a separate image, which is actually a different group of women who were photographed at the end of Speke's expedition in Cairo. And through doing some research on both on the published and private records of explorers, it's possible to recover fragments of the biographies of these women. And some of them then went on to live in Zanzibar after the expedition. And these sort of brief but tantalising quotes remind us of the much larger networks on which explorers depended. But as we've sort of discussed, like finding these sorts of references did also throw up some of the problems with working with digitised archives, or the challenges with working with digitised archives. One of the things I found was that I was trying to find reference to, the embodied labour of exploration, and there's lots of idioms in the English language. So if you put in terms like cooking, you find things like cooking the books. You find someone, or you want to find about someone talking about their eyes, you find in my eyes, I knew in my guts. These are all sort of references that will just sort of drag up things that maybe you weren't looking for. So there's still this need to sort of search through and use a sort of manual search to pick out the things that are actually relevant. Obviously, there's also the challenge of explorers writing in very pejorative and offensive language a lot of the time, and navigating the ethics of putting those search terms in and using them. And then I think, and I described it to someone earlier as learning to Google like a Victorian. So I was looking at Florence Baker, who was married to to an English explorer who met Speke in East Africa, and I was trying to find references to her in places I knew they existed within the archives, and I kept putting Florence Baker in, and I was searching it for ages, and then I was like, why can't I find anything? And I put Mrs. Baker in, and it suddenly comes up with lots of stuff, and it makes you realise that there is a slightly different skill set to develop in terms of thinking about how things, or how people were referred to at the time. And this is something I've been trying to do a bit more during my teaching when I've been teaching with primary sources to students is trying to get them to think about how can they use these collections in their research, but also how they need to maybe understand the context from some of the secondary literature and the published sources to understand what to look for in the first place. So I guess I became a digital archive researcher to some degree by accident, but it has changed the way I approach research, and I'm really excited to continue using these techniques in the future because I think it offers to research and teach about collections differently. Thank you.